to the next work, which is WATERFALL, which is inspecting the impact of the water replenishment cycle on California's Central Valley groundwater resource. So take it away, team.
Thank you, Santiago. Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay? Great. So yeah, last but not least, we have WATERFALL. And I am Malika, again, to introduce myself for those of you who have joined. I'm one of the design interns and ended up doing a little bit of development on this project. And I'm a master's student in computational design at Carnegie Mellon.
And I'm Noah, the other designer on this project, and also contributed to the development a little bit. And I'm a master's student in design engineering at Harvard.
And we also had Malvika Bhatt contributing to some of the CS development, and she is an undergrad student at Olin. And we were really happy to work with JT and Kyra, both of whom are working at JPL and have been awesome collaborators, and they're doing really impactful work that you'll hear about in a second. So WATERFALL is a tool to visualize the drought cascade in California. And again, here's a little sneak peek of the design of the tool. But to go into the bigger context of it, I think most of us are probably aware that California is facing a water crisis. And it's also in the unique position of being sort of the agricultural hub of a lot of the United States, providing a lot of produce for the whole country. And so this provides a really challenging situation. So when there are times of drought, farmers in California have to draw on this hidden and essentially non-renewable underground source of water called groundwater. And the way that they do that is by pumping it. But pumping of groundwater has historically gone pretty much unchecked. And this is, we're starting to realize a problem because groundwater is kind of the buffer or the cushion for the whole water system. And as we keep depleting that puts an even bigger risk during times of drought. So policymakers are starting to find that they need to place limitations on pumping to mitigate even bigger crises in the future. And in order to do that, they need an accessible way to understand all the relationships between the different parts of the water system. So water inputs, this pumping activity that's happening, and the actual groundwater levels. Of course, it's not that simple, and there's a lot of challenges with information access that have made it difficult to understand those relationships, and they've led to more reactive rather than proactive management of water. So the first problem is that data that's been collected on water levels is pretty sparse in space and time. So you can see on the right is well data that was collected over California. And in certain areas, it's a lot denser, but those observations that they're taking are not really regular over time. Thankfully, JPL is playing a really big part in addressing this problem through its GRACE satellites, which have given researchers the ability to actually remotely monitor groundwater levels from space. So Kyra and JT, the researchers we've been working with, are using GRACE data along with other data to actually use it and build these models to address the second problem, which is that this pumping activity that's happening is essentially a black box because it's not tracked at all. There's no way to know how much water is being pumped unless we look at sort of the state after pumping happens. So they're building models based on this GRACE data to actually shed light on that black box and give policymakers a better picture of water use in California. And finally, the other problems are that the data for these different hydrological layers involved in the water system come from so many different sources and in totally different file formats. And existing tools that try to bring this together are really difficult to navigate, and they don't really support analysis between the layers. So there isn't really a clear and accessible way to actually bring all this together and understand the relationships between groundwater levels and these other water layers, as well as pumping. So the task that we set for ourselves is essentially to bring all of these data layers of water together and provide a straightforward but comprehensive view of these layers so that we can start to understand the cascading relationship between them, the kind of cause and effect between, you'll see on the right, precipitation, snowpack, surface water or reservoirs, and groundwater, which is as that water seeps into the soil, it starts to replenish that underground store. And specifically, we wanted to support understanding when, where, and by how much water inputs, like you see on the right, will impact future groundwater levels. And as Noah explained before, our process is kind of similar for all the projects. So we started with contextual inquiry, which involved a lot of time spent with Kyra and JT, understanding their work with modeling and kind of the bigger context of the work that they do and how they're really narrowly focused on modeling groundwater, but having this bigger context of the other hydrology layers gives them a ton of value. And after that, it was followed by all these iterations of design and data exploration and making sure we understood the problem correctly, all of which led to today's prototype, which Noah will go into. Oh, sorry. Actually, first I will talk a little bit more about our process. So yeah, these were a lot of the explorations we tried along the way. And I think some of the main things that we found were that there's a lot of value to seeing these different hydrology layers changing alongside each other, both in time and space. And especially exploring this idea of multiple stacked time series to see seasonal cycles and this cascading effect alongside different map views to see the spatial effects.
And our solution is WATERFALL, which centralizes all these different layers of hydrology data and really allows our users to understand these changes across the sort of three dimensions that we care about here, which is time, magnitude, and space, all of sort of which supports the building of intuition about these relationships that will hopefully inform future planning. Just to give a quick overview of the tool before we jump into the demo, we have basin selection. We can switch between these different view modes that we'll talk about. We can select a different time range. And that brings us to sort of our main view where we have a 3-year time series view that's taking up the majority of the screen. We've got this, what we're dubbing a flower plot, which is allowing us to see sort of all these attributes and their values together. And then there's a map view that's able, you can kind of drill in a little bit deeper and understand the spatial relationships. And now we'll switch over to a demo. And I'm going to ask you all to imagine that I'm a hydrology researcher at JPL for the sake of this demo. And I also am going to ask you to imagine that we're traveling back in time to April 2020, which is the latest year we have data on, although the future of this tool will be incorporating real-time data. So we can imagine that it's April. Here we see our 4 attributes, precipitation, snowpack, surface water, and groundwater. And we see a time series chart for each. And what you're seeing here is the black bars are representing the mean for each attribute for each month for all the available data that we have. And I can see here in my waterfall tool that the snowpack this year is lower than normal. It's actually falling below the mean. And as a researcher, what I want to do is get a sense of how this low snowpack might impact California groundwater levels in terms of those 3 dimensions, time, magnitude, and space. And really try to understand how worried should I be about this low snowpack. So I'd like to find a similar year, maybe, where we had low snowpack and use it as a precedent and try to see how that low snowpack might have impacted these other layers. I can tell from my time slider that we've got some low water years somewhere in the 2011 to 2016 range. And so I'm going to drag the time slider to 2011 and take a look. As you can see, for all these years, we have these really nice seasonal cycles that are emerging. And we can scrub over these time series charts and see in the top right corner the value of each layer relative to each other and also relative to their mean, which is in black as well. So we can kind of see how these things are fluctuating. And we can also see how these values vary spatially on the map below. And here you're seeing that for groundwater in particular. I can see that in 2012, we had a low snow year, but it didn't really look like it impacted groundwater levels that much. So maybe what I'll do at this point is take a look at 2012 to 2014 and see how this plays out. So this is actually getting pretty interesting. It looks like in 2013 and 2014, we had more low snow years. And here we really start to see it dramatically impacting both groundwater and water levels. At this point, what I'm going to do is switch to my snap to mean view, which is going to show all the values relative to their normal sort of monthly mean. And this is providing me with a really clear way to see just how much a few years of low snowpack can really start to impact groundwater and surface water levels. Even as rain kind of stays relatively constant. We had a little bit of a low year in 2013, but not as much of a fluctuation as we're seeing with the other ones. So just the snowpack changing is actually having these dramatic changes in reservoir and groundwater data. And I might want to take it a little bit further and look at how this low groundwater is varying spatially. And here I can sort of look at the map and scrub across the timeline. What I'm seeing is that while groundwater sort of does get low during these times of drought, there is this cycle of replenishment, and sort of as we scrub throughout a year, you'll see the map getting lighter and darker. But there's this kind of gray sliver in the middle of the map where we don't really see that happen. It's just kind of low all the time as we scrub across the time series. And what's really interesting about that is that's actually where the Central Valley is in California. And that's telling me that that's an area that I really need to pay close attention to. We're not seeing the same sort of cycle of replenishment in this area. And what's so exciting about this tool is that I was able to sort of very quickly get some key takeaways about what this year's low snowpack might mean for future groundwater levels by looking at these historical precedents. You know, I've been able to learn that it really takes multiple years for low snowpack to have a big impact on groundwater levels. So while I might be worried, I know that I should be really worried if next year we see low snowpack as well. And I've also learned that we need to be particularly concerned about the Central Valley in terms of groundwater. And at this point, I might kind of go drill in further and try to understand where in the Central Valley in particular these levels are low. But now I'm able to share this data in this tool with my partners at the Department of Water Resources and really inform how they're going to decide to regulate pumping in the coming year.
Awesome. And now we can talk about how we actually built this. So one of the big challenges with this project was actually getting the different data layers together. As we mentioned, that's kind of been one of the main things that's also kept it from being useful to policymakers and researchers, is just bringing all of that together. So that was a big part of the development, was just getting the data from different places and also converting GRACE geotiff images to CSVs, all of which we did in Python. And then processing all that data to a single format, just so that we could treat all of it the same way. And that, again, was also in Python. And some of what we did was binning all the data monthly, because some of it was daily, which was just way too big of a file to deal with. And then also binning it by California basin and gridding it to a 1/4 degree, which is the same resolution as GRACE, the groundwater data. And also computing that difference from average per month and per basin. So that was when you saw the bars above and below the baseline. And also smoothing the data using a rolling mean with a 3-month window, because especially with the rain data layer, that oscillates so much that it's actually more useful just to smooth it out to see where, say, if you had like 3 months in a row of a lot of rain, that actually starts to mean something rather than just 1 month of a lot of rain. And finally, we developed this interactive prototype that you saw that actually allows users to visually explore the data once it's in this single format. And that we did using P5.js. So it's a JavaScript-based framework. In terms of future work, we see a lot of opportunities to keep adding more functionality to this. So right now it's a fixed 3-year window that you're looking at. And that's because you can focus on a single year, as well as kind of the like peripheral vision around it. But we could imagine users wanting to select bigger ranges than that. Also changing different bin sizes for the map. So changing that size of the grid of the map. And then smoothing all the layers more. And I think there's a lot more sort of data analysis that could happen. Another big piece would be just building in more data layers. So right now we're just looking at precipitation, snow, reservoir levels, and groundwater. But as I was mentioning, the whole water system is really complicated. There's a lot of different pieces involved. And so things like building in things like soil moisture, or even the geologic texture, and subsidence, which is when the land sinks in reaction to groundwater being pumped out. Bringing all of that in could just, it would just augment the the value that this tool gives and broaden the perspective that it offers. And finally, as Noah mentioned, actually incorporating real-time data would be really valuable, so that there's this immediate pipeline for pulling in real-time data, processing it the way that we did, and seeing it visually in the tool, so that you can start to diagnose what is the year ahead going to look like based on the rain and the snow that I'm seeing right now. And also, as you saw Noah doing sort of intuitively, we could start to build in things to the tool to support finding those historical precedents where you're looking at this year there's much lower snow than average. Let me find other years where that was the case and see how that played out. And we could start to do that computationally. And again, to summarize our contributions here, before there were kind of these different layers of data in different formats. So there's a geotiff image from Grace, and then some basically CSVs coming from for the other data layers, all from different places. And after we have this tool to really easily and intuitively see the time relationships between these different layers all in one place, alongside getting that spatial view of it too. And we see a lot of ways that this could, as we were talking about, that this could continue to be more useful as we build in even more functionality. And we're just really excited that we can contribute to such a pressing problem, especially in California. And again, we want to thank our awesome partners, JT and Kyra, for the time that they've spent with us, helping us understand this problem space and the work that they do, and just giving us the opportunity to do this. And thank you again to our mentors, Hillary, Santiago, Maggie, and Scott, for their help throughout this process, and their support in helping us understand the problem and get to this awesome final design. So again, we can open up to questions.
This is JT. Can I just say that you guys did a great job, and we really loved working with you. And we had, from our side, we had a bit of a unique project here because we kind of have this already funded NASA project through NASA Applied Sciences program to do this work, and it's ongoing. We have kind of a year and a half left on the project, and we just didn't really have any visualization going on for the project. And so this was a great opportunity for us just to have this kind of sandbox to just play with ideas and concepts on how to understand this data and the relationships between these different data sets. And I just say, I think we were really impressed by the creativity from Malika and Noah from the design perspective of like, all right, how do we wrap our heads around this problem? What do you guys want to do here? And then they kind of took it the extra mile of figuring out how to make that a reality. So for us, there was a question, discussion earlier about sustainability. We have funding specifically to kind of build from this prototype and work with data scientists at JPL and leverage what's already been started here to add some of that additional functionality and then plug this into our project here, so that this will be a major component of our kind of final deliverables for the project. So just wanted to say that for everyone, and we're really grateful for Hillary and team and the whole team there for supporting, and Malika and a great work this summer. So thanks.
Yeah, this is Paul again. Maybe I missed it. This is all data driven, right? There's no hydrological model built into this cascade at the moment. Is that right?
No, this is not using any modeled data.
But is the vision ultimately to, put models into it? And I guess this is a question for JT, and compare the data to the model outputs.
Yes, exactly. That's pretty much the mandate of our project is, USGS runs these kind of groundwater models for the Central Valley called CVHM. And that model it not only does groundwater withdrawal and groundwater depletion, it also does subsidence, so surface deformation. And a major problem they have with this model is the calibration of it. So originally, you know, we had this really huge idea, like, let's include, you know, INSAR observations and GRACE data and well data and all this stuff. And what we did was we focused more, I think, during this 10-week period on the design elements. Like, what will this look like? How will people experience it? How will we be able to interact with the data and be able to make kind of scientific assessments at first look by looking at all these data sets together. So yes, the future plan is definitely to bring in the CVHM model outputs, as well as subsidence information from probably Sentinel-1, and tie that in with that whole cascading hydrologic cycle to try to identify the conditions and timing of changes in the valley that we're seeing from space.
Right. Yeah, it looks really great.
I know one of the things that was so exciting and interesting about this project was kind of really figuring out what in the very first places would be to help kind of support the science team's intuition about really the connection between the rainfall, the snowpack, the subsidence, and ultimately the reservoir levels, and really see that we could actually, that the data could drive and in fact inform those inquiries. But I'm also excited in being able to see those connections longer term to the modeling and really look at it both as a way to see how the different data, how the data contribute differentially to perhaps some of the differentials that the model might actually have. And I think then it really becomes a really important part of potentially an important part of how the scientists understand what's really the underlying phenomena. And of course, I think what made it also such an interesting and complicated place to do some inquiry was because the work that JT and Kyra have been doing are also really supporting here policymakers. And so one of the other objectives was to be able to make sure that the tool was able to support their ability to see the kinds of connections that ultimately the model would be able to drive.
And I think again, this kind of summer goal, we ended up focusing much more on the design and the concept of how to present all this information together. But I think sort of a secondary goal became, because the models are really hard to calibrate, and also they kind of require, it's not like right now, and JT, you can correct me, but our understanding is that they're kind of hard to run unless you have an understanding of how they work and how to use them. And so for policymakers at like the Department of Water Resources, for now, a tool like this, where it's kind of kept more straightforward, they can really easily understand and kind of build their own like intuitive model for now of how these different layers of the water system affect each other.
Yeah, and I think, Malika, I think you said it nice earlier in the introduction that, but in like these physical systems, we tend to think that things are really predictable. And the one element in California that's not that predictable is just human behavior. So when it's dry and then farmers decide, well, we're going to pump a lot of groundwater this year, it's hard to quantify exactly what that's going to look like. But with this visualization approach, where we see this kind of cascading impacts where, okay, this year there's less precipitation, so there's a little less snow, and then groundwater kind of dips down, 6 months or 8 months later in response to that, then we can begin to quantify some of those kind of characteristic relationships and lag times and magnitude, and kind of do the first job of trying to estimate what humans are doing, try to predict what humans will do in certain conditions. And that's a pretty cool scientific outcome.
From a design perspective, I think we find it really fascinating that we've got this policy infrastructure. This is, you see, human, political, and it's an infrastructure, right? This socio-technical infrastructure. And then on the other side, we're trying to work with geological timescales. And I think that was where we first started seeing this path of like the cascade And that while on the back end, we're doing all this work of like data transformation and it's like binning it. And that on the front end, we're trying to say, what are the simplest components that will show that relationship? So it was actually very interesting to, although focus on the science that you're doing, JT and Kyra, but to also take into consideration, how does that fit into this larger infrastructure of ways of looking at data?
I think I just want to add one other thing, which I think applies across all of our projects actually, which is that sometimes when we talk about these kinds of things, we do talk about like seeing, you know, how is something going to look, right? But I think that sometimes what we potentially overlook, I'm going to use some seeing puns now, is that the process of asking a question about how something is going to look is actually a question of discovery, right? So it's not just like styling or on the surface, but is actually when you see something, it is like, oh, aha, you know, and that is the thing that I think is the connection that we are making across all of the different disciplines in our program. It's not just, can we see this so that we can show it? It's, can we see it so we get it, right? So that's sort of not just that, you know, we can say, show it to someone else, but that we, you know, or the researchers themselves understand. So the visual practice and the practices that where we are developing interaction between, you know, interacting with the data through visual processes, that's something which is allowing for a different kind of way of understanding and seeing the data. So I guess I just want to kind of highlight that in the context of all of these processes, all of these projects, because that's really what our program is focused on, and that's what we do.
I think that's such a nice point to add, Hillary, in that I think there are a lot of folks who have a relationship with visualization where they understand it as a kind of, it serves a communicative function. And I think there's, you know, there's a place for that work without doubt, where scientists especially want to communicate a technical concept to perhaps a non-technical or public audience. And I think those are really beautiful problems. And especially, I think that's one of the most important things that NASA can do as a way to help explain to the public who's funding the work what benefit they're getting out of it. And so I think, and we actually have spent some time in the program focusing on that type of question. In fact, we worked on a few years ago a follow-on project with one of our students to actually work on communicating something about the scale of the effects of climate change. But I think what Hillary's point is actually more about visualization at serving an analytic function. And I think that's one of the main things that I think we tend to find with the scientist teams that we partner with. And it's that actually the act of seeing is in fact helping them to understand their data in new ways. And I think that's the part that always seems to me the most impossible to say with confidence, because we feel like we're going into disciplines where folks spend their whole lives and are so deeply expert. So it feels a little too comfortable with you know, our ability to say, oh yeah, we can make insight. But actually, I think as outsiders of a discipline, but bringing this particular capacity for visualization into the discipline helps us somehow triangulate a way to look at the data that I think can often take the research team out of their current set of practices and actually see things in the data that they haven't really seen before. And I think that's something that we have seen a number of times and has been just quite exciting. In fact, one of the things that we've been able to see through some of the times that we've recorded is we actually got to capture real moments of discovery where teams actually saw hypotheses that they've been trying to figure out, and they saw first evidence of them. And that was just a really remarkable thing to be able to support. And so that's really one of the reasons that we think this is that we think infusing these capabilities into Caltech and JPL are one of the ways that we could actually, in addition to advancing connecting to the public, that we could actually advance the science, the fundamental science themselves. Did anybody have any other questions that they wanted to ask? I guess since we've got a couple of moments and we're, I think we sent out one invitation that ended at 10:30 and one at 11. So depending on which one you got, we're a little bit over, but we're gonna stick around till 11 and just make sure we can answer any questions and maybe try to recreate as much as you could the loitering that you would get after one of our presentations at JPL and Caltech, where you could just maybe ask some of the folks in, it's hard to say slightly less formal setting because we're all still on a WebEx telecom. And unless we make 25 breakout rooms for this, it's going to be a single shared conversation. But we're happy to kind of stick around and just, you know, to folks' ability and interest to ask follow-ups, you know, just feel free to chime in. And of course, if you guys, you know, have other things to get to, by all means, check out as you can.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. And congratulations to all three projects, all three interns, all 5 interns.
I'm thinking a lot right now, in part for other projects that we're working on, around visualization is not the end result. It's actually the technique that sits at the heart of the whole kind of dialogic process that goes on between interns and the PIs, and also with us, the mentors. So it's a very elastic expertise. And I think we're using visualization, whether it's on a mural board, on a whiteboard, mixed fidelity, to really interrogate questions of, well, how do you structure and design a beautiful question? How do you have a generative question? How do you ideate on having understood or misunderstood? And I also commend like our partners who are not afraid to pick up the, you know, the pen and rush and say, no, this is what I'm trying to say. And I think that what we end up seeing on the screen is kind of unusual in that, as a layperson, I often thought of scientific visualization as being what I saw in a PDF, an illustrative, pictorial output that explained a story, as opposed to this dynamic tool set where the data in itself encodes a huge number of models and hypotheses and instrumentation. So I'm really excited that this literacy, this visual dynamic is becoming more current in how we all work together. I see we have a question from Anne. Hello, Anne, about how both the prototypes and the process enabled them to think differently. I guess we have Kyra here. I'm looking to, and seeing some of our other scientists.
Victoria and JT, and there's a number actually, several.
Yeah, and it looks like there's an interesting question from Evan recently. Oh, sorry, was somebody about to say something? I didn't mean to cut.
Yeah, we're still on the project before Evan. I mean, the question before Evan. Yeah, Victoria, do you want to say something?
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I can tell you from our perspective, we've had, you know, the real great opportunity of working with the design team for 2 years now. So I have this extra, you know, 12 months of sort of assimilation of thinking about how to integrate these tools. And from my perspective, you know, we've, as it was shown in the beginning, there's a lot of Excel spreadsheets and data streams that are often found in a lot of disparate places. And so the ability to be able to synthesize this and to look at it visually is really useful. And the element that was brought together by the team this time was to be able to not just look at the data that we had already generated, but to make some predictive hypotheses on the fly when we're in the field. And so it's very, every hour we have on the seafloor is incredibly valuable. And so the best we can maximize this with having these kinds of tools, I think the better off our science is going to be. And so it remains to be seen like how we're going to be able to do this on the fly. And I'm really excited to actually try this out. And I'm hoping that the design team will join us with these ship to shore telecons. And so we can hopefully, and or if we have like glitches in the software, we can ping Adam to figure out what's going on. But I'm really excited about this being sort of an iterative process, and it's been an incredibly rewarding experience. And I look forward to continue to work with you guys. But visualizing things beyond just looking at bulk numbers, I think has been very, for me, transformative in kind of the way that we deal with our science.
Victoria, I actually wonder if you, I mean, I don't know if you can be a little bit more specific about that, but I'm really curious about, like, when you see your data in a visual form that we're providing, can you say a little bit, I mean, or maybe not anybody from your group who's here who wants to talk about this, you know, I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about what is it that you actually see, right? Like when you're able to look at it and say, oh, now I understand whatever it is, right? Which would be maybe different from, or a different experience than looking at the work, at the data on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, for our science, we're really interested in this interplay between the geochemistry and the physical environment and the microbiology. And oftentimes those relationships are complex. And you can maybe distill that out doing correlative analyses, but you often lose the spatial component of that. And so for me, what's really powerful about this is that we have these amazing abilities to create very high resolution photomosaics and topographic maps. And so we can now sort of extrapolate over an aerial extent and possibly into the seafloor the importance of specific types of metabolisms, energy gradients, all sorts of things that are hard to do in sort of the two-dimensional, you know, spreadsheet data stream. And so that's really where we hope we can go. You know, we're very interested in the deep sea, but you can imagine this applying to any kind of multi-data project that uses sort of the spatial extent. And so whether it's sort of a agricultural soil project and people want to look at that over time, I mean, I think that having the basic framework to work in is going to be really helpful. And so hopefully the tool can get out there to multiple communities.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah. Oh, Anne, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that, sorry, quickly. It's interesting. I mean, I'm sorry that I missed the first presentation, so I only saw the last two, but both projects, it strikes me, were, you know, have a relationship to the physical world, right? And so what I heard in those two presentations was a way for the scientists to think about and understand and relate to the physical space where these phenomena happen in a more, I don't know, sort of direct or embodied spatial way. I'm curious, is that an aspect of it? I mean, I'm thinking about the observation of the Central Valley, or, you know, the ability to be, you know, on the ocean floor and think about what's above you, beside you, and, you know, all of that, in a, like, to bring the data into that space feels like what you might be talking about. And I'm curious if that resonates for you.
Yeah, I don't know if the waterfall team wants to chime in, but I'm happy to talk about from our perspective, being at sea, having the ability to have a tool like this out with us that allows us to sort of integrate, I think is useful. A lot of times it's not until we get back to shore that we can really distill the data, and hopefully this will allow us to make informed decisions and really start to understand in a more meaningful way where to sample next and plan our dives in the future. JT, do you have
Can I
something you
follow
want
up
to
on
add?
that? In terms of Victoria's problems, one of the things we're doing in the C4 is looking at 2D maps and trying to understand a 3D world. And so the 3D extrapolation is important. If we could do that in real time by using a proxy measurement like temperature, there are temperature probes that would allow us to do a grid and look at the 3D temperature structure as a representation of what's going on in the subsurface, and then make real-time decisions on where to core. And these tools would allow Victoria to do that, I believe.
Nice.
I wanted to mention, and at the beginning we were talking about how we identify projects. I think that part of the nature of working with Caltech and NASA is this relationship with reality, with the physical natural world. So for example, when I think of like the ocean microbiology that Victoria is doing, I think of extreme environments, and that correlates very well with what we think about when we're doing spectrometry or some other kind of manipulation through Mars rover, right? How do we know, how do we instrumentalize, how do we work with the data that comes from these physical infrastructure of instrumentation that marries models in the lab with the reality of the exploration as it's happening over different kinds of time periods. And I think that whether it's geology and planetary science, or we're looking at some of, for example, N3D, which was a project we did on cell, or we're looking at robotics, there's a relationship with reality that is always at the heart of what it is we're trying to understand more about.
Just to speak to that too, Anne, and I think you just said this in the chat, but I think what I see as what's valuable across all the three projects is that when you get like a CSV of data, it's abstracted, and it's not really the way that we think. And I think what all of the tools that we built this summer do is in visualizing it and kind of resituating it in space. It kind of takes away that layer of cognition that you need to do of like kind of constantly reminding yourself what these abstract values actually mean in context.
Actually, maybe Victoria, you could talk about this, because it's interesting that once you have your data model and you know where to dive, you literally do. And there is a physical embodied sensation about the relationship with your seeps.
Yes, I feel very at one with our seep environments. I think, I could see an advantage even beyond like having a collaborative of scientists on the ship looking at this data and making decisions. The other value I see in the tool that Adam and Malika and Noah put together for us is the ability to turn off suites of the data that we have, the actual data, and look at how that changes the model itself. And so this gives us some indication about just how much additional data do we need to potentially collect in an area to feel more confident in the findings. So Rob was mentioning the temperature probe data. Like there's some certain data streams that really lend themselves to on-the-fly collection at sea, and so we want to try to leverage that as much as possible to help us understand what's going on. But if we could put this thing on an iPad, you can imagine taking this down in one of the human-operated vehicles with us, with a student who might not have as great familiarity, and then they would be able to use that as an additional resource to help with dive planning beyond, the clipboard that we usually hand them with some dive targets. So I can really see this, sort of enabling the science going forward as much as we're starting to integrate this kind of computational technology at sea. Yeah, and VR, so it's crazy. They're actually starting to build these 3-dimensional models, and you can wear headsets. And so we've done this not on the fly, but that's their hope, is that we'd be able to see these things in sort of 3 dimensions, and with specifically, position cameras on the sub. So I think that that's going to happen in the next 5 years or so.
That's a great point that I wanted to mention before during the ocean's presentation is we don't take the decision to go into 3D lightly. We see 3D and our first instinct is to say, how can we make it 2D? Because the framework of a screen and the pixels make so many things, comparison, color correction, all these things a lot easier than if you are immersed in a 3D space. But there is some speciality and some physical relationships that only make sense in 3D. So we have to make sure that those are there to make the leap into 3D. And I think in this case, the interpolation was really cool to look in 3D and interesting, and some of the relationships, especially there was this uncertainty value that was not able to be wasn't shown in the demo. That again, once you get to it, the 3D understanding really does kind of help a little bit. So yeah, even VR, it's once it's going to go through the same process that we do for everything else. Testing, trying it out, looking at alternatives, and seeing what is most efficient and what's best. So that's always exciting, yes. There's still a question from Evan on the chat, whether the groundwater fall tool is going to be able to be tested with the GSAs.
And Malika actually wrote a note there, but go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually the long-term goal here. So even though we designed this for us scientists in mind, we kind of had this byproduct for the future in mind, which is it would be great to be able to break this into GSAs and give this information to the groundwater management districts within the Central Valley. So people may not know that there's this Sigma policy framework that was enacted by Governor Jerry Brown in 2014 that says that pretty much all groundwater pumping in the Central Valley needs to be in balance in sustainable pumping, not depleting groundwater by the year 2040. And these GSAs need to have a plan in place by like 2022, essentially now, to pull that off. And the problem with these GSAs, these little groundwater management districts, is they don't have a lot of technical expertise. Sometimes it's a couple guys in like a trailer, and they might be able to look at some Excel spreadsheets. So, it would be really helpful for them to be able to wrap their heads around NASA data and these model outputs in a way that they could quickly draw conclusions about how much groundwater is disappearing from their district, and you can't really manage something unless you have information about how it's changing. So that would be the ultimate end goal. I think that was a great question. Yeah.